The cost of college continues to be on the rise, as is student loan borrowing. But to what extent is the borrowing of student loans actually a driving factor in the skyrocketing cost of a college education? Today, I'm going to be joined by John Tamny, a vice president in FreedomWorks and editor of RealClearMarkets, to discuss and debate that very question. It's going to be a fascinating discussion. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. And Jimmy at the Crossroads starts right now.
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Hello, my friends, and welcome to another edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, once again coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner, and it is such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today, as it is always. Thanks so much for joining us on a Tuesday for Tuesday with Tamny. We'll get to that in just one moment. I do want to encourage you to like and share this video. If you enjoy the content, would sure appreciate that. Also, be sure to check out the podcast edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. And be sure to follow our friends at the Washington Examiner at washingtonexaminer.com. So as we talked about in my last episode, student loan debt has been on the rise. And the Democrats are pushing a student loan forgiveness scheme, particularly for federal loans, $1.7 trillion or so, that is outstanding at this point, with about 45 million borrowers. This is an issue that has a negative impact on the economy. It's pulling back individuals from advancing their lives. But what do we do about it is one question. Another question is, how in the world did we get here? We're going to talk about that today with our guest. John Tamny is vice president at FreedomWorks. He is editor of RealClearMarkets and the author of a number of books, including one I think coming out pretty soon on the pandemic. John Tamny, welcome back to the show. It's good to have you, sir.
Hey, Jimmy, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So is that book coming out? Is that moving apace?
Yes, it comes out next month. It's titled When Politicians Panicked. Everyone should buy several copies of it, but it's an economic history of what happened from March on and the economic tragedy it was for people, not just in the U.S., but around the world.
Yeah, I think it's so important. And now we're really realizing all the negative implications. I mean, Colorado, for example, was doing all right for a while last year, at least relative to other states. And then by the end of the year, the state where I'm in, again, Colorado, was 50th out of 51, including the 50 states and the District of Columbia when it comes to unemployment, and that's because of ever-tightening policies, John.
Yeah, it's so unfortunate. As we know from economic history and world history, economic growth is the biggest enemy of death and disease by far. Poverty is the biggest killer. And so historians will marvel that this time around, the response from politicians, Democrat and Republican, was to force economic contraction as a way to fight a virus. I can't think of a more backwards, more dignity-robbing, more life-robbing, more blinding way to fight a virus. You don't fight a virus with a lack of freedom. You fight it with freedom. So that's what my book is all about. I can't talk about it without raising my voice. This is easily the biggest human rights tragedy of the 21st century, and needless.
John Tamny, I look forward to that book, and we will definitely have you back on to talk about it. All right, so I want to get in a moment to the question of how we got here with regards to $1.7 trillion in student loan debt, how we got here in terms of the cost of college consistently rising over the years. But before we do, I want to set the table with some points of agreement here on the program, John, and starting with one that is fundamental. You point this out in the beginning of a piece that you wrote a couple of weeks back for Real Clear Markets, where you were editor, and that is you point out how the student loan business is not something that government should be involved in at all. I completely agree with you. What's your reasoning for saying that?
Government is not empowered on the constitutional federal level to be educating people. So there's just certain things. It's not about whether you love or hate student loans. There's just certain things the federal government shouldn't do. And this is one of them. If we want to then say college education is vastly overrated as a way of preparing us for the future, yeah, I agree with that. There's lots of reasons to not do it, but no, there's just, I think too often we get into the weeds. No, government just shouldn't do this.
Now, I remember back when I was in college, economics was my minor, and I remember taking a microeconomics class, and I got into a conversation with a professor who insisted that because of social demand, government should be involved in pursuing higher education, particularly in terms of providing student loans and other educational financial support, because of this idea of social demand, that society improves and is better off when more individuals are educated, including higher education. What say you to the argument about social demand, which I'm sure you've heard in many different contexts?
You hear it in different contexts, as you allude. I reject it. I think student loans actually harm those with the least the most. Well, let me explain. There will always be rich people who can get the best SAT prep classes, that can have the best connections at certain elite schools. That's always going to exist. That's human nature. But what the poor and those with less used to be able to do is they could go to, I don't know, call it a Humboldt State in California, call it a Cal State Northridge, call it a SUNY Purchase in New York, not famous name schools, but they had a college degree and they got it by working 3 jobs. It was a major sacrifice. And so the degree said something about you, that you got it the hard way. And so it didn't matter that you didn't went to Harvard, you accomplished something very difficult to accomplish. And I think that's the tragedy of, to me, the biggest tragedy of student loans is that when you make college available to everyone, you diminish the people who really used to scrap their way to a degree. You diminish their accomplishments, and you make it so that it's all about getting into the most elite school because that's where the businesses go to, not because you learn anything more at Harvard than you do at Humboldt State, but because at Harvard, you've got a pretty safe bet. It's hard to get into. You're pretty interesting kids. In the past, those with the least could say, you know, I got through here in the toughest way possible. Now they can't say that.
So, in other words, one of the byproducts of the student loan system, particularly becoming nationalized by the federal government, is that you have more people who have decided to go to college by virtue of the fact that they are better able to afford it because of the student loans and other financial aid that is provided to them.
Yeah, I think so. I think certainly on the lower, in schools that we wouldn't call elite, I think this is most definitely, and I think it's an area where we agree, it's lifted them, it's made schools capable of operating that otherwise wouldn't, and in the process, it's devalued the degrees from there. If college is easily achievable in ways that it wasn't in the past, you're shrinking the value of the accomplishment. And so I think for, let's call it the unknown, call it the forgotten schools, whatever it is, it's kept them in business, but but they've produced people who probably in most instances probably were wasting their time with college in the first place, and they didn't learn anything any more than you learn anything of value at Harvard.
John Tamny, again, our guest, editor at Real Clear Markets and a vice president at FreedomWorks. Let's jump in and show a little bit of data about what's going on in terms of the cost of college, number of borrowers, and so forth. Here's some information that demonstrates that student loan borrowers have gone up to about 45, 46 million. And then if you see as well, the rise in student loan debt, it's gotten to $1.7 trillion. And that is a pretty noticeable increase in student loans. So when you're talking about more people taking out loans offered by the federal government, I completely agree. Now, then you also have the cost of college that has been rising. This goes back to 1963, and you can notice some trends, and particularly the top line there is when we're talking about private colleges and universities, and the middle line, or the lower red one, is where we're talking about public colleges and universities, both for 4-year degrees. And you can see as well where the uptick particularly happens is in the 2000s. And I would contend that that is largely because of federal policy that has provided more student loans and grants under the Obama administration, and what Obama did in 2010, and also in nationalizing the student loan system, and also what George W. Bush did before him in advancing or expanding federally guaranteed loans, and before that, when they, under Joe Biden's bill, got rid of bankruptcy protection. We'll get to a lot of that in a moment. Now, in your piece for Real Clear Markets, you argue abolish federal student loans, but don't expect college tuition to fall. And you have some points that you make in contention to my argument that more credit available to students has incentivized them to go to college than they otherwise would, although I think you just said that, and that this has been a driving reason for the cost of college going up. So clarify what your argument is.
Well, my argument is this. Let's imagine if we abolish student loans tomorrow, federal student loans, and let's imagine also, better yet, let's imagine if Harvard suddenly announced we're tripling tuition and we will no longer accept kids who need hardship aid or student loans. Does anyone think that it would take Harvard even an hour to fill out that class with really smart, talented kids? I don't think so. I think that's true of a lot of elite schools. Implicit in this argument from our side that, oh, well, lots of federal student loans that cause tuition to rise, is that no other factors come into play when it comes to college education and the cost of it. The reality is that demand for U.S. colleges around is global. The Chinese weren't a factor in tuition 20, 30 years ago. Now they're a major factor. And so my argument is that when you look at elite schools, there hasn't been really any impact of all the federal lending. Tuition was going to rise and could have risen much higher at those schools just because demand for them is so great. It's enormous. And it has, to me, it has nothing to do with federal lending. It's just that there's only one Harvard, there's only one Princeton, there's only one Stanford. And so again, if you tripled tuition there and said no kids with student loans, you'd still fill out the classes with really smart kids.
And yet we're not just talking about the Harvards and the Stanfords and the Princeton universities of the country, John Tamny. We're talking as well about the Colorado State universities, the San Diego states. We're talking about every college and university almost in this country that accepts federal student loans has also seen a noticeable rise in the cost of college over the years. And that's where you get a broader argument that talks about how more people, as we just discussed a moment ago, more people have gone to college than otherwise would because of the availability of student loans and grants. And then, of course, colleges and universities recognize that and see it as an opportunity to raise their prices outside of just the Harvards, Princetons, and so forth, which do tend to cater to higher income, more affluent individuals who also were able to get into those types of elite schools.
It's a good response, but then the argument, as you know, that I make in the column is that if it were as simple as our side wants to make it, and to be clear, again, I want to abolish federal student loans. I don't think they should be there. I think they do cause many more people to go to college than otherwise would, and so a lot of people waste time generating debt they wouldn't otherwise have. But let's look at private schools across the U.S. And on the high school and elementary school level, for them, at least as far as I can tell, there's no federal lending toward this. But if you look at any private school around the U.S., tuition has skyrocketed at those schools, much as it has for private colleges and public colleges and universities. And so I'm merely making the point, it's not so simple to say, oh, look, the federal government's lending and that's why tuition's rising in colleges. Okay, well, if that's true, explain to me why tuition for private schools before college has similarly soared. And it's a reminder of what I'm trying to say is that, look, scarcity probably is a much bigger driver of tuition increases than federal lending. And we know this from private high schools.
So I looked into some of the possibilities for why private high schools may be rising in tuition, because you're absolutely right. The cost of private high schools has been going up. I got a graph here that helps to demonstrate this point, and you can see that there is a rise in annual tuition that has been going on since, and this graph is 1999 through 2000 on to 2020 to 2021, and you can see a multifold increase with the top line there being for secondary, that is private high schools. So without question, while the cost of college education has gone up, you have seen private schools, high schools going up. But why? Why is that? And by the way, I will concede as well, and I don't really think this is a concession. I agree that the cost of college is rising, John Tamny, for more reasons than just the student loan system. But I think that when you look at the makeup and how college education is structured, and the fact that you have 75% of private school borrowers, private school students taking out student loans, 65% graduating with student loan debt who've gone to public schools. It really is noticeable that you see a lot of students going to college who take out student loans. So that is one factor that is different in the system. And also, by the way, when you talk about the way that student loans are set up, you have to keep in mind the FAFSA form and how somebody who's going to college at the age of 18 has to fill out an intrusive form that asks a lot of financial questions. Not everybody fills it out, but most students going to college do, even affluent ones. In fact, especially those who have greater incomes tend to fill out the FAFSA. And then the FAFSA information gets provided to the institutions. Wherever you're going to go to school, wherever it accepted you, they get the information. Then they provide you the financial aid package, and they, through price discrimination, can say, hey, you're eligible for this amount of loans. We're going to give you this grant. They can do everything they want to manipulate that price without you really seeing what that price is or what the actual cost is of the college that you're going to. So there's not really transparency or sort of free market there, particularly because of the way the student loan system is set up, something that is a critical difference from private high schools. You also do see that there is a difference in terms of how private high schools are also giving out aid, but from their institutions. They give out a lot more. In fact, student aid to students going to private high schools has gone up, John, even more than the rate in tuition increases has gone up. And moreover, you do have a different type of competitive environment in terms of private high schools that are going up against public schools that are absolutely free. So there's a sense of premium content or premium service that you're getting and college prep experience that you're getting from private high schools, where they have always charged that sort of premium. And so when you look at that structure, and there's some other key differences as well, I think it's an apples to oranges comparison for the most part. Well, there are some overlapping similarities to the rising costs, such as energy costs and healthcare costs going up. So a lot there. Go ahead.
Well, but it's apples and oranges, but it's probably one that favors my argument more than it favors the opposite, because consider private schools are generally local. Now, you can point to a lot of elite American private schools that attract a global student body, but generally it's local competition, yet the prices of private school are soaring. And so you can say, well, yeah, a lot of that comes from donations and people that go to the tuition fund so that kids can go there. Well, how's that not true for colleges? You talk to any professor, why have professor salaries risen at the Alabamas and Clemsons of the world? I don't think it's federal aid. I think you know what it is. It's Dabo Swinney and Nick Saban. Schools that are winning on the football field attract a lot of money for their scholarship funds and then also for the professors. So, but when you look at markets, yes, certainly private high schools, there's local demand, and the cost of it has soared since when I was in high school, and I'm older than you are. You see something similar with colleges, and is it any surprise when, okay, I entered college in the late 1980s, I'm embarrassed to say, that was when much of the world was still under communist or socialist control. Fast forward, 30 years, and you have people from around the world who want to go to leafy American college campuses, and they have the means to do it. again, I think with elite schools, and we can define elite in the U.S. fairly broadly. This isn't about federal loans. This is about there's only so many spots, yet there's soaring demand, and that's not going to change for these very few spots.
Well, but there isn't really soaring demand overall in the higher education system because when you look at enrollment numbers, for example, and I went down a little rabbit hole here when it comes to enrollment to compare private high schools and undergrad and both all and full-time students. And data that I found showed that there was a decline in enrollment, particularly from 2011 to 2017 in colleges, and a slight decline, but relative similarity or consistency on to 2021 for the higher education level. But you did see a decline in enrollment, yet you still had college tuition that was going up. You still had student loan borrowing that was going up dramatically during that period of time. And in that period of time, you saw private high school enrollment go up. And one thing that you can think about when it comes to basic economics is the idea of supply and demand. When you do have more demand, John Tamny, for a product or a service, and then the supply is relatively the same, then you see prices rise. But we have actually seen demand for colleges and universities decline, and yet the cost of colleges continue to rise.
Did you break that number down, though? Is that just because, I mean, come on. Let's look at those numbers. Was that true for Harvard? Was it true for Stanford? Was it true for Princeton? Was it true for USC? Was it true for Colorado Boulder? Have they experienced
overall
decline?
Overall, I
yeah.
don't believe so.
Overall is a big difference between if we take, okay, is Colorado Boulder the most desirable school to go to in the state of Colorado? I'll wager a pretty impressive sum of money that you haven't seen that same scenario that you describe. And same way, again, with Harvard, Stanford, and again, elite schools, I think what you'd find is that no, demand has risen. And we also have to factor in, where was the demand coming from? What we know is that Chinese students, as an example, since they can't get federal loans, will pay the full price. And so how much is demand for them going up? In my book that came out last year, I forget the number because I don't have the book in front of me. The number of Chinese college students in the U.S. in the 70s and 80s was too small to really count. But nowadays, and this was in the early 2000s, the number was 300,000. And let's factor in that these are 300,000 kids that are going to pay full price. And so I think you have to, A, look at the school, and B, you have to look at who's applying to the school and what their finances are.
Yeah. So John Tamny, again, editor of Real Clear Markets, vice president at FreedomWorks. When you keep talking about private elite schools, when we're talking about sometimes public elite schools, when we're talking about Harvards and Princetons and so forth, absolutely there has been a noticeable rise in tuition there. There is this sense of elite status. It is harder to get into those colleges and universities, although we also have seen an uptick in those that have benefited from student aid programs, particularly because they are trying to do outreach into more diverse communities. And so you have, it may not be a majority, but you still have a lot more people that are attending those kinds of colleges because that sort of aid is available. But I don't think you can also just say, okay, we're going to put the private schools in this group or the elite schools in this group and then set aside the rest of the system. Because when we're talking about student loan forgiveness, for example, and we're talking about the overall systemic factors, and I do think that student loans are a factor when you consider 75% of private students are going to college with student loan debt. I think that you absolutely need to consider some of those factors, but nevertheless, you cannot separate the idea of the elite schools as one group from all across the country and the average when we are especially talking about a public policy discussion and public policy implications that are much broader than one segment of schools.
Well, look, only an idiot would say that it has no impact. I just think that our side vastly overstates the impact. And again, ask yourself for those private schools, let's say elite once again, the Harvards and Stanfords, let's say they just said, we're not taking kids who need student loans anymore, but we're tripling tuition. How much do you want to bet they could fill out a freshman class within an hour and have very smart, accomplished kids? The demand for it is enormous. So I'm just rejecting the notion that our side clings to. Find a person who's more anti-government than I am.
No, sure.
But I also want to be reasonable. And I dislike when our side just says, well, look at this price going up. Oh, it must be government. No, it's not. There's lots of things that go into into tuition for schools. And we see this on the private high school level where tuition's also been soaring. So I'm not disputing that. And as you note, when we began this, I don't doubt that if you, gosh, let's think of if you Menlo College in Northern California, and that's different. That's always attracted kind of an elite student body, but I'm sure we could point to all sorts of colleges that if there weren't federal student loans, they probably wouldn't. I do think you probably see a bit more of, quote, tuition inflation for schools that aren't very desirable in a market system. And only an idiot could say that that wouldn't be true. And so my guess is if we got rid of the federal student loans, it wouldn't mean anything to the Harvards of the world, wouldn't mean anything to the USCs or the Colorado Boulders, but I bet it would mean a lot to some of the lesser schools. And they'd probably go out of business, and I'd say that's a good thing.
But John, here's the problem, is that when you argued earlier that there are a lot of students who are going to college because they have access to student loans. That's something that we talked about in the beginning of our conversation. Those student loans are available because of the federal government getting involved in providing those loans and thereby disrupting the market for college education. Whenever you have government step in, you know this well as anybody, better than most people. Whenever you have government get involved in doing something that distorts markets, it also distorts the pricing of those markets. And especially when you do consider the nature of the FAFSA system and how that form is filed, and then those institutions get the information, and then they provide a financial aid package that is structured or set up in a customized way for those students, then they're able to manipulate that price and then make it seem like they're getting an even better deal or what have you. You never really see what that value is. And by the way, getting a college degree now is basically a baseline in order to be successful. At least that's what they say. And so there are so many people who are going for that as well. And when you have that baseline, that diminishes the value of that degree. So it's not like we're getting better quality college education or that the degree is more meaningful than it was back in the past, say when you graduated from college. And yet we continue to see the cost of that product and service across the board go up in cases where you have some elite status, like you're talking about, in terms of the higher profile schools like a Stanford or a Harvard. And you also have college tuition going up in all sorts of different levels. And you cannot just set aside, and I don't mean that you necessarily need to say, okay, it is the only factor.
Well, no, but where have I done it? I've made very clear that probably for schools that don't get a lot of applicants,
but it's certainly more than that. It's certainly
some
more
inflation.
than that.
And did I not say very specifically that it's devalued a college degree?
Yes, you did. You did say that.
In the past would have been much more valuable because it would have signaled, okay, I couldn't afford to get to a Stanford, but I got myself through that. So everything I've said agrees with that. So I don't understand what the argument is here.
Then I would say that you're
where I disagree is when our side says, well, yeah, Harvard's expensive because of this. Oh, please. It's not serious. It's not, I can't stand unserious arguments. So parents clearly around the world and kids will pay up a lot for an elite designation. And we see that, and how we know that is because in scenarios in the US and around the world where there is no federal lending, tuition is soaring, which is the argument I've made all along, while saying over and over again, we devalue the degrees of those with the least when we do this.
Yes. Okay. So I agree there. But my issue is that you are limiting the influence of student loan borrowing, especially given how many people do it, that there is on higher ed institutions, not maybe as much at the Harvard and Stanfords of the world, but yes, at University of Colorado, yes, at Colorado State University. I've looked at those data points. I've looked at Colorado, various institutions here in this state. That, for example, going back to 2008, when I got in, this is a long time ago, but when I got into Regis University, student loans were integral to making it possible for me to go there. Now, yes, that is a private school that did have a little bit more of that elite elite status in the sense that it is a private school. But at the same time, I was someone who only was able to go there because I was able to take out student loans. So I don't think that you can discount the role that that can play even in those areas. Well, I mean, when it's a small school, and in this area, this region, it is more of an elite sort of institution, and it only had about 1,500 students when I went there.
I mean, Jimmy, look, I hear you, but once again, if it were as simple as our side wants to make it, then logic dictates that private school tuition across the U.S. would be pretty flat over time because there's no federal lending. But the reality we see over and over again is that what's seen as desirable, no one wants to admit it because it feeds the victimization needs within some on our side to say, oh my gosh, there's no markets involved here and schools don't teach and isn't life awful? The U.S. is ending. The reality is markets are far more at work when it comes to education than anyone on our side wants to admit.
No, John,
and we know that because in areas where there is no federal lending, access to elite institutions continues to raise in price. Now, again, am I saying there's no impact from federal lending? Again, only an idiot says that's so ridiculous. But when you presume it's a factor with the Harvards of the world, I think you ignore the fact that, if they got rid of it, and look, we'll never see this. If the feds got out of education, said we're out of this altogether, if you think that tuition for the Harvards of the world would decline, you're dreaming.
John Tamny, our guest, just a few minutes left here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. So first of all, I don't think that tuition would instantly decline if you got rid of student loans. I think that there would be a lot of institutional challenges with suddenly saying, okay, we're going to go cutting our tuition offerings by about 20%. I think it's something that would take time if we ever got to that point where you and I both agree, where we didn't have especially federal student loan system. But I do want to say that while I agree with you that there is less of an impact of student loan borrowing and federal grants and so forth on those elite institutions at the college level, and you certainly see that where it's non-existent when it comes to private high schools, you also can't and must recognize. Do you recognize that there are fundamental differences in how the K through 12 private school situation is set up and the whole K through 12 educational system is set up and the college higher education level? Do you agree that in terms of how they are financed and how they operate, that there are fundamental differences, that there are crossovers, but also fundamental differences in how those markets work?
Well, both have major development offices that seek outside donations. So I don't think it's as big as you think. And I would just say, once again, if you're going to say there's a difference in markets, you're supporting my argument, because private schools are generally getting demand locally from a very small market. With colleges, as we know, walk around University of Southern California, a school that when I was applying to college, I could have gotten in a heartbeat. The University of Spoiled Children. Now it's incredibly difficult to get in there. And a major factor for that is there are more Chinese nationals at USC than I think any school in the United States. And so is it federal student lending, as our side likes to say, it's got to be government every time? Or is it because demand from a part of the country part of the world that used to be starving several decades ago is suddenly very, very substantial? I think the bigger factor by far is global economic growth. And I think when you use the example of private high schools versus colleges and say that's a different market, you support my argument. Because the Chinese aren't demanding to go to local private schools.
Well, so fair enough there in terms of, and I don't know the percentage of enrollment that is from outside the country and inside the country. And I would suspect that the vast majority of college students in America are still American enrollees. But when I talk about a difference in the system, I'm also talking about how you have K through 12 in an environment where it is predominantly public school only, that is provided free of charge by government. So you at least ostensibly are having taxpayers pay for it, so it is free, against private schools which have the aura, yes, of what this institution offers that is unique, that is different from these free schools. But the private schools now are also facing increased competition from charter schools, another opportunity for many students to be able to get oftentimes a better education, or at least provide other choices for parents. You do have a situation where rising fixed costs are happening. Actually, this is the case for college level as well. So when it comes to energy and healthcare, But you also have even more of an emphasis on the idea of a premium education for private schools at the high school level than you do at the college level when we're talking about the overall system that has seen dramatic increases in student loan borrowing and the cost of college. And so I think when you look at the nature of the two systems, there are fundamental differences that make the markets very different in terms of a comparison. You have a much more of a competitive marketplace, I would say, in those local communities where you don't have as many private school opportunities there than you do at the college level, when you have a million different, from private to public to 2-year and what have you, and yet consistently at the college level we see prices rise. My point is not that the only factor is that the student loans is a big thing in the cost of college. But also it is that there is a big difference in how the market is structured, how it is set up, and how it works in both cases. And that's key in terms of the influence of student loan debt, I think.
Yeah, look, if you want to believe that, feel free. Ask yourself the question again. Take your most elite private schools in Denver and ask yourself if they got rid of financial aid altogether. I'm dying to see where tuition drops, because I don't think you'd bet on that either. And if it's going to be about charter schools that are competition, presumably that would bring down the price, but I don't think you're going to see it happen. We're talking about ultimately demand for what is a limited concept. There can only be one, whatever the most elite private school is in Denver. And to pretend that if we just get rid of all these different things that you claim drive up the price, I think you're still going to see demand for it rise, because we live in a free, booming country.
No, but I think there's a big distinction in terms of financial aid at private high schools is provided by donors almost exclusively to those institutions. When you go to the higher education level, student loans are provided not by the institutions, but by the federal
You don't think
program.
There's not a private scholarship fund at these colleges?
There are.
You think that private and public schools, there's not?
There are.
Okay.
And no, I agree. There are endowments, there are support, there are scholarships that are given. When I went to Regis, I was given a scholarship from the institution. Absolutely. But that exemplifies, if we got rid of all student loans and you still had that, then it's different than getting rid of all student aid altogether. If you still have student loans and you got rid of the institutional aid that was given, then you would still have a problem, in my view.
Yeah, my guess is you'd still have enormously high tuition at the quote desirable schools, because and you'd see it on the private and collegiate level, even if you got rid of it altogether. I mean, look, I don't know the deal with Hillsdale. Hillsdale doesn't accept federal student aid. Can we check out what its tuition was in 1988 versus 2021? You want to bet that it's yeah.
John Tamny, I have a final question for you, and this one is more a reaction to the Democrats, where I think we will have agreement. When it comes to student loan forgiveness, I want to play a clip from the announcement a couple of weeks ago when Chuck Schumer and Elizabeth Warren and Ayanna Pressley got together and did their press conference announcing that they would like Joe Biden to forgive up to $50,000 in student loan debt across the board. Let's play a clip here.
Proud to stand alongside my colleague, Senator Warren, and Senator Majority Leader Schumer to reintroduce this resolution urging President Biden to be bold and responsive to the movement that elected him by taking executive action to cancel $50,000 in federal student loan debt.
So the idea behind this is to put more money into the pockets and better long-term prospects for young people who are starting their economic lives. In the long run, canceling this student loan debt will be a big positive, not only for those families, but also for our economy.
Many of us believe that there ought to be greater stimulus, and even in Build Back Better, the president believes better stimulus. This is a giant stimulus for the economy, getting the economy moving again, getting it out of its doldrums, decreasing unemployment, increasing small businesses, increasing economic activity that could be done with the flick of a pen.
Stimulus with the flick of a pen, according to Chuck Schumer, John Tamny. Now, there are $1.7 trillion outstanding in student loan debt. This proposal, I think, would get at about half of that or a little more than half of that. So my question to you is, if the government spends money from the private sector, whether from taxpayers or from federal borrowing, in order to pay off student loans or to spend for any other purpose, does that stimulate the economy?
No, in order to stimulate the depressed, you must depress the stimulated. I suppose if you promised me that if they canceled the debt, the money wouldn't go back to government, there'd be something laudable about it, because we know that anyone paying this off, it's not going to get back to the people who actually produce the tax revenues in the first place. But to call it stimulus is laughable. Look, my only quibble with this is when our side says, well, this is all about the elite being subsidized by the working class. But wait a second, what does our side always say correctly? It's the elite who pay the vast majority of taxes. So I suppose what this would be is the elite subsidizing the elite or something like that. But no, I think it's a bad idea rooted in dumb economics. But again, if you could promise me that the 1.7 trillion wouldn't go back to the government, I'd say, ooh, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I also agree in terms of, it's a good point about the affluence benefit from taxes when taxes are paid by the elite and then it goes to the elite. It's an interesting point that you raised, but there's a fundamental fallacy though when it comes to stimulating the economy that we're seeing all too often, including with the broader so-called stimulus package discussion. I can't even say debate, because now the Democrats are already just hell-bent on passing $1.9 trillion without Republicans having any sort of say. And there's this presumption in Washington that government stimulates the economy when it spends money in select ways they think are beneficial. The only way that government can stimulate the economy is to get out of the way, John Tamny.
Absolutely. Look, government only has money to spend insofar as economic growth already occurred. Government can only redistribute the fruits of growth, it can't create it. And I would much prefer our side focus on that than these other things about who benefits. Look, government should not be in these things. I think the challenge always is we get into these side debates when the real argument should be, what should the federal government be doing? And the real argument should also be, as we both know, that government, of course, cannot stimulate. It can only spend the fruits of growth that already occurred. And so as a rule, it can weaken.
Yeah, and distort the economy by doing whatever spending it is or regulatory changes or what have you. But I definitely think that when we talk about the focus on higher education messaging, I agree with you that the unfairness argument is not the right one. And that's really what's fundamental here when we talk about the idea of regressivity and what have you. I don't think that that's the right playing field. I think data, for those opposed to student loan forgiveness, data on that demonstrates that it's not a winning argument. I talked about that in my commentary on Friday. But also when we talk about whether or not government should do something, here's my concern, because I absolutely agree with you, and I'm willing to make that case. But I don't know how you can actually win on that in the short run. It is a very long run. We need to plant the seeds kind of discussion, which is one of the reasons why I focus on opposing student loan forgiveness, because I think it will make the student loan system worse. Because then, and actually, I never asked you for your thought on this aspect of student loan forgiveness. If student loan borrowers took out student debt and then had it forgiven, and then new students go into college thinking maybe I'm going to actually get this forgiven as well, would that increase the enrollment and then also the incentive for colleges to raise prices? So a lot there. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it wouldn't surprise me. Again, again, only an idiot would say that. Maybe some would say, oh, well, if this is going to be for free, I'll borrow more and I'll be even less tuition worried. Again, does it mean a lot for the really difficult to get into schools? Probably not a whole lot, but it's still wrong. It's still immoral. And no doubt with certain schools, it would prop up schools that otherwise wouldn't exist. And thankfully so. Look, I don't care if it's Harvard or if it's Humboldt State. Nothing you're learning in college has anything to do with what you're going to do once you're out in the real world. That's particularly true in a dynamic economy like the U.S. College should be acknowledged for what it is. It's a place for people to gather, to grow up, make friends, and learn a few basic things that they will learn on the job as is, and they can be in a place where businesses can find them and say, oh, you got through something difficult, you got into something difficult, we think we can work with you based on that. But to pretend that there's actual training going on is laughable.
Well, and I would say this as a final parting thought. It is easier to get a student loan today than it is to get into college. And that is actually a very distressing concept. John Tamny, editor of Real Clear Markets, VP at FreedomWorks. My friend, always great. Thank you so much for taking so much time today.
Thanks for having me. Great show.
Once again, John Tamny, editor of Real Clear Markets, a vice president at FreedomWorks, and author of the forthcoming book, When Politicians Panicked, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads today. Very interesting discussion. I think he does raise one very important point. Now, I think he understates the role of student loans in the system. I think that there's too much data to underscore that that point is valid in terms of the availability of credit, encouraging more people to go to college who otherwise wouldn't, and thus colleges and universities continue to raise tuition. But he does raise an important point about certain institutions that may be less susceptible to that kind of influence. Because while a more affluent student may be able to go to college without taking out loans, they are, because that opportunity is available, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the Harvards and the Stanfords and the Princetons of the world are going to be upping their tuition dramatically as a result of the availability of student loans to students going to those institutions, because they might go there anyway. That's a fair point. But there are a greater number of institutions that are not in that group of elite schools that consistently see their tuition rising, and where you do have many students who would not otherwise be able to go because they couldn't afford college, taking out loans, and then that continues to encourage more student loan borrowing. Let's consider as well the rise of student loans and the years. If you look at this chart, you can see a clear correlation between 2007, about that time period, and the rise in student loan debt, while we still see the number of student loan borrowers relatively stagnant. Moreover, when you look at the cost of college, you can see a significant jump in the cost of college in that same time period. The top line is private schools for a year. The lower middle red line is 4 years of public schools. And you can see that precipitous rise in both levels during that period of time. The elite schools that Tamny's talking about fall into the top category there, where there's always this sense of a premium. But you still have a notable rise going on in the many more public schools that are available. And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we look ahead at addressing the student loan forgiveness discussion, and as we consider how we got into this mess in the first place. There certainly are a variety of factors. When I emphasize the role of student loan borrowing, that is not to say that it is the only factor, but that I contend that by and large throughout the higher ed system, it is a driving factor when it comes to the skyrocketing cost of college. Because when you have credit far more available and easily accessible, what have you got? Incentive for colleges and universities to raise their prices, even as overall enrollment across the country has gone down. Again, remember, look at this. John was talking about private high schools, and their enrollment has gone up. When you increase enrollment or demand for a service, that can contribute to rising prices. But when it comes to undergrad, whether all or full-time, on average, of course, as he very much pointed out, you saw a decline during that same span of time as you saw a rise from 2011 to 2017 in enrollment. And then enrollment has been about flat since 2021, yet we have seen the cost of college precipitously continue to skyrocket. Even John agreed that student loan borrowing contributes to it. That's an important point that he made, or that he conceded. I just think that he understates the role in how student loan borrowing has contributed to the rise in the cost of college. But it's an interesting discussion. That's why I wanted to have John on. He's always a thought-provoking thinker. You know, it is interesting when you talk to John Tamny and you're arguing with him. You have a debate. You got to be quick. You got to be fast. And one listener to the radio pointed out once that another host had been sort of silenced by John, became speechless, rather, in a discussion with Tamny. I think part of that is because Tamny says things that are just absolutely unexpected. Another part is he's a very quick thinker. I've had that experience as well, so it is always a treat and fun to have John Tamny on a show for debate, especially on Tuesday with Tamny. I forgot to acknowledge that with him in the beginning of the show. Gosh, oh well. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. That is it for us today here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Once again, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. My thanks to John Tamny for joining me on the show today. My thanks to the Washington Examiner for their partnership. And, of course, to you for watching, subscribing, liking, and sharing our content. We so appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day. We will be back in a couple of days with a discussion with Corey DeAngelis of the Reason Foundation about reopening schools. You will not want to miss that. In the meantime, once again, have a great day. And as always, God bless America.
Talking politics, great for generations. Oh, what mix. I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.